and welcome to the third lesson in the course Getting Started. Today we'll be covering the basic rules of the game. Now, before we get to that, let's review what we've learned in the past, and what we want to focus on are the pieces, how they move, and how they attack. So let's start with the pawn. So the pawn, on the very first move, as you know, can either go forward 2 spaces or 1 space, and for every subsequent move, it can only go 1 space at a time. And how would it capture? A pawn would capture diagonally, as you know. So if a pawn was here, you'd be able to capture it diagonally like this. The next piece would be the knight, and the knight is the only piece in the game that can hop over other pieces, and it moves in an L shape. So on the first move, this knight could go somewhere like here, or this knight could go here. Now the next move is the bishop, and of course the bishop can't jump over other pieces, but it can move diagonally as many squares as it wants. So this bishop can go all the way over here, and as you know, it also, of course, captures the same way it moves, captures diagonally, so you could take the pawn here. The next piece is the rook. So the rook moves vertically and horizontally as far as it wants. Very simple. And the queen is a combination of the rook and the bishop. So it can move horizontally or diagonally. So the queen is very powerful. And this, when it's over here, it can take this pawn, like here, or it can even take this pawn, because it can move vertically and diagonally. And the last piece is the king. The king obviously can only move in squares adjacent to itself, so it can travel all along these squares, like so. So that was a review of the pieces. Now let's go get to the basic rules. So the first basic rule I want to cover is check. So check is when the king is under attack by another piece. So let's start off with a basic example. If these were the starting moves, white could deliver check to his opponent's king by playing this move, bishop b5 check. Now, what's so special about check? Well, there's only 3 legal possibilities to defend against a check. One way would be to move out of the way, another way would be to block the check, and a third way would be to capture the piece that's checking the king. So let's examine our options here. Can black move out of the way? No, because the king can't move here because he'd still be in check, under attack by the bishop, and he can't move anywhere else because he's blocked by his own pieces. Can he capture the piece? It doesn't look like he can capture this bishop. So his only options are to defend against the check. So he can play block with the pawn, like so, or he could even block with the knight, like this. So that leads me to my next point, which is, what if black can't do any 3 of these things? Well, if black can't defend against the check, let me set up an example here. We have something called checkmate, and checkmate ends the game. So this move would be checkmate. This is checkmate because black can't do the 3 things. Let's go through it. Can he defend? Can he move his king? No, he can't move here, 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 or here because they're all blocked by his own pieces. Can he block the check? No, because his king and queen are right next to against each other, so he obviously can't move out. He obviously can't block against this queen. Thirdly, can he capture the piece? No, he cannot, because this queen is nicely defended by this bishop right here. So all 3 criteria are fulfilled, and this is checkmate. And checkmate ends the game in favor of the player who delivers the checkmate. So in this position, white would win. So the score would be 1-0, or white wins and black loses. So we've covered check and checkmate. Now let's move on to the next important rule, which is castling. Now, castling deals with king safety, which is important, but we'll cover the specifics of that later. Let's just deal with the basic rule of castling. So let's set up a position that allows you to castle. So let's get these pieces out of the way. Now, castling can occur when the king and the rook have no pieces in between each other, and this also would apply on the queen side. So let's focus on the king side for now. So castling is when the king moves 2 spaces towards the rook, and the rook jumps over the king, like so. So the move would king would move 2 spaces over, and this rook would jump over the king, like this. And it's the only scenario where the king is allowed to move more than 1 space, because as you know, the king can only move in adjacent spaces normally. But when he can castle, he can actually move 2 spaces over, and the rook jumps over. So let's look at queenside castling now. Let's play a few more moves that would enable queenside castling. So just make some more moves here. And now in this position, let's say black castles here. White can actually queenside castle, which is exactly the same as kingside castling, except on the other side, the king moves 2 spaces towards the rook, and the rook jumps over. Now, there are a few caveats that you have to consider before being able to castle. The first thing is, if you move your rook, either of these rooks, on one side, you can no longer castle on that side. So let's say I move my rook here and I move my rook back. I can no longer castle on this side, but I can still castle on the queen side if I wanted to. But let's say on this side I move my rook here and I move it back. I can also no longer castle on that side. And the last scenario is if I move my king up and back, I cannot castle on either side. So in these three cases, if the king rook moves or the queen rook moves, I cannot castle on the side that moved. Or if I move my king, I cannot castle on either side. And the last thing we have to consider, I'm just going to set up a hypothetical position here, is say we had this sort of position, where this bishop attacks this square on f1. Now, this is the case where you cannot castle through check. So castling kingside is actually illegal here, because this f1 square is covered by this bishop. So also, the case if this g1 square would be covered by an opponent's piece, you would not be able to castle either. And the same thing obviously applies on the queen side. So that's castling. Now, the second rule we're going to cover here is pawn promotion. This is also a special rule. And it happens when a pawn reaches the last rank. So as white, it would be if white reaches the 8th rank, or as black if black reaches the 1st rank. So let's again set up a hypothetical position which would allow for pawn promotion. So if this pawn's on the last rank here, or second to last rank, excuse me, he can promote his pawn by moving to the last rank. Now, here the pawn can do one of 4 things, and this is decided by the player. It can promote to any piece it wants, regardless of whether it was taken or not. So it can become a knight, it can become a bishop, it can become a rook, or most commonly, it can become a queen. Naturally, most players would like this to be a queen because it's the most powerful piece. And you can choose between any of these pieces, and it stays like this for the rest of the game. So that's pawn promotion. Now, the last rule we're going to cover is probably the hardest to understand. It doesn't happen very often, but you still have to know it. And it's called en passant, which is French for in passing. And it occurs in a very special case that I'm going to set up here. So as you know, pawns can move either 1 square or 2 squares forward on the first move. So in this position, if black decided to move his pawn forward 2 spaces like this, now these pawns are adjacent to each other. So en passant occurs in this specific scenario when a pawn has just moved forward 2 spaces and there's an opposing pawn adjacent to it. White can actually take black's pawn like this in passing, or en passant, as if it had only moved forward 1 space. So if you think about it, it's equivalent to black moving forward 1 space and white taking black's pawn like this. Now en passant is special because it can only happen right after your opponent has played his pawn move. For example, if I play this move and then he plays another move, I can no longer take en passant. This only happens immediately after the move. So in this position, I have to make a decision. Do I want to take en passant or do I not? And then after you make the decision, you have to stick with it. So if you take it here, you take it en passant, and if you make another move, you can no longer take that pawn en passant. So that concludes the lesson basic rules. Thank you for watching this video. Now go ahead and apply what you learned to the exercises.